This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.
Yesterday had a bit of a sensitive conversation, I suppose. Sensitive because of the sort of information that is contained in a book called Lives on the Line. It's authored by David Africa, who served as an intelligence official in the police services in around the dawn of democracy till about the year 2000. He formed part of a task team that saw others, the likes of Mzwandeli Petros, Jeremy Vieri, Peter Jacobs, Anwar Dramat. I think I read Arno Lemour's name somewhere in there as well. They were the guys, together with some apartheid-era security branch people that were going into the transition, that were still working for the police service. They formed part of this, cohort of intelligence officers that had been investigating PAGAD. And some very startling things were revealed in that interview. The confirmation that PAGAD had been infiltrated, and it wasn't just PAGAD, it was PAGAD, Qibla, and the Islamic Unity Convention. He spoke about that infamous killing of Staghi in Salt River and the subsequent meetings that had taken place. The book is very vivid in that it holds details about where supposed secret meetings were being held, the modus operandi of PAGAD, this, that, and the other, and some eyebrow-raising moments, with the claims that PAGAD was, together with Qibla, which is more the ideological house of what he calls an attempt to establish an Islamic state, that this bunch of people were always against the democratic dispensation and so on and so forth, and that David Africa, the author, believes to be the case, and so for many people living on the Cape Flats during the 90s and even now, PAGAD was seen as a vehicle with which to be able to confront an ever-growing problem of gangsterism and drugs. And so that was the book review yesterday. And look, it's an ordinary book review. We do it on a Monday morning, different books and documentaries and so on and so forth. It just so happens that yesterday was quite let's call it an interesting conversation with David Africa, and we thought to get PAGAD's response there too. And from PAGAD is its working committee member Cassiem Parker, that now joins us on the line. Cassiem, assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
I'm certain you must have listened by now. I've asked the producers to send you a copy of the interview. Before I get into bits of details of what the book contains and things that came from the interview, your immediate reaction on the sort of sentiment taken by David Africa.
I didn't. Sorry, I'm having feedback. Yeah.
Oh, so sorry, but that is actually on our end. I do apologize for it, but we can hear you quite clearly.
Okay. So I'm saying I didn't read the book, but I've listened to the interview yesterday. And to me, the first reaction is it's probably more a lack of intelligence than intelligence.
Okay. I'll come to what that means. But let's deal here with what Mr. Africa says was the state's concern was that there was this vigilante group that was spreading urban terror that needed to be curtailed. That the methods employed by PAGAD were methods that were in contravention of the law, and thus there were concerns about ideology and what the stated goals and aims and objectives of what is often referred to as the movement had been, and this particular movement, that coalesces PAGAD, Qibla, and of course the IUC. How do you respond to what at least was said, and how you understand, that sort of seminal moment had been, the fact that there was, some sort of a relationship at some stage between those three organizations, and what the purpose of those organizations had been, whether it was truly to establish, as he puts it, an Islamic state.
Okay, so therein lies, I think that deserves a response. I think if we look at the utterances of David Africa, he says it all starts with a hunch. And, when you're looking at this, they also did this assumption that PAGAD started as an opposition to the democratic government. Now, this sort of thing was not based on reality. It wasn't based on truth. It wasn't based on fact. It was based on a hunch. Now, I want to jump to his next statement, which said the ANC thought that PAGAD was targeting them or the democratic order, and the National Party's intelligence thought that PAGAD was a vehicle for the ANC. Now, both of them can't be right, but it's possible that both of them can be wrong. And I think these are the things that, an NP person might argue that they had a different hunch, and they employ people to make the story fit their hunch. I need to address the issue of Qibla, IUC, PAGAD. So now, there is no question that some members of PAGAD had been members or were members of Qibla and IUC before. But that doesn't mean that PAGAD was driven by Qibla. In fact, it wasn't driven by Qibla. So, and I'm saying this because I was involved with Qibla at some level before I joined PAGAD. And I had left Qibla. And then I saw PAGAD and I went to PAGAD. But I want to tell people that there are members of Qibla that were inspired by the reality that when you go onto the political spectrum, it wasn't to get a cushy job in parliament if liberation comes to the fore. It was to implement what is right and to forbid what is wrong. And when you say that was my motivation, then after so-called a democratic order was established, and you say, but now there are people in power, there are people that have been elected by millions of people, do I now rest on my laurels and do nothing? When we say implement what is right and forbid what is wrong, and you say this scourge of drugs and gangsterism is the next biggest threat to our children, then you turn your attention to say, let us be the saviors or put some protection between those people and the community in order to save them. So the inspiration might come from the same thing, but it doesn't mean that it was essentially spearheaded by Qibla.
The inference created, of course, by David that, that Qibla was the sort of ideological force behind the likes of PAGAD, and it was then that there was this particular opposition to the democratic project, which of course you've now responded to, has in hindsight led me to wonder, because look, he goes on and he makes the point about how this grouping did not quite have mass support in other provinces. It was a fraction in the Western Cape, and that it didn't enjoy support among Sunni Muslims. Is the claim in the book, as it were, etc. And then it goes on to highlight, of course, that this group was though a threat and a concern because they were highly armed and started then to start operations in which, gangsters were being targeted and so on. Look, I mean, he didn't come to, or at least he didn't vocalize an outright defense of gangsters. But, naturally, I suppose one of the questions that I have is that, and I put it to him that, if PAGAD's stated goal was, anti-drugs, anti-gangsterism, and that was its focus, why was it deemed necessary by the state, for instance, to come to the protection of those whom PAGAD had been targeting? And one of the responses there too was that, PAGAD's stated goals were perhaps noble, but the use of violence was not going to achieve anything, and had been in contradiction of the law. Thus, it invited, a concern on the part of the intelligence community to infiltrate PAGAD. I want to hear your response to that, because what David seems to suggest is that there was a particular concern with the methods that PAGAD had been employing, which I suppose for very many years has been subject to interpretation and controversy.
Yeah, before I get to the methods, we can't run away from the fact that he said, and it actually emerges that this was a political instruction. It's the ANC and the rest of the ruling party that felt threatened, but for what reason? The reasons emerge when they say that they reached out to PAGAD. Now, the essence of it is that he cites PAGAD's march to Dalla Omar's house as the indication that it is politically inspired. So PAGAD makes no apologies for the fact that we are very politically aware, that we are aware that the political parties have a responsibility to the community, but it's not in our interest to take over their job. It's in our interest to push them to deliver what they've undertaken to do. And that's what the March to Dalla Omar tried to achieve. But Africa distorts the facts, because that march to Dalla Omar's house was in response to the problems that people had in Tafelsig. And it was saying, you guys are not prosecuting the perpetrators. And what was Dalla Omar's response? His response was, let's engage. He put together a meeting between PAGAD and Parliament. After that, there was a meeting with Frank Khan, who was the Attorney General at the time, where there was an undertaking that PAGAD will work in conjunction with agents of the state in order to try and get this problem sorted. Not the problem of PAGAD, the problem of gangsterism and drugs. But then, in the meetings with Frank Khan indicated that there was a big problem with drugs coming in at the harbor and at the airport. And when PAGAD said, we will then go to the airport in order to demonstrate so that this issue can be highlighted. We applied for a march, we got permission for the protest at the airport, and Mac Maharaj unilaterally decided PAGAD, despite its permission, cannot have its protest. And we said, this democracy that Africa is talking about, we said, we have the right to protest. We've gone through the process, and therefore we will do it. Mac Maharaj doesn't have the right to just cancel it. And that was actually upheld in the court 6 months later. Now, what we're saying is that when we're asking why do the politicians do this, and we're saying, is this not the same reason why the organization or the part of the police that in later years did the investigation on the killing of high-profile drug dealers? It was called the Unit Investigating Crimes Against the State. You can check it in the records. So what is happening here? PAGAD is seen as a threat to the state. And when a drug dealer dies, it's investigated by a unit that's called Crimes Against the State. This is where the facts emerge.
And I think that is, I suppose, one of the.
Sorry, I just want to add.
Okay.
I just want to add. There was a statement made that the state also attempted to reach out to PAGAD via the Center of Conflict Resolution. Now, I need to put this on the record as well. I was part of the discussions there, and two of the police, people who were not as senior as they became later, Mpembi and Lamour, were two of the police people that were part of that investigation. And I know they were actually quite enthusiastic about the fact that there could be cooperation between PAGAD and the police in order to tackle the drug issue. We then, they said they had to refer to their seniors. And but they asked us that we must stop the weekly marches. There were marches on the road twice a week. And they claimed because the police resources were used to monitor the marches, and therefore they couldn't tackle the drug dealers. Now we undertook it. But that is the strategy. When they came back to us, a month later, some of the people in that delegation had been arrested by the police. And they came back and said, the commissioner said, they can't negotiate and talk to people who have pending cases. Now, that it doesn't talk to reaching out to people against gangsterism and drugs.
Okay. One of the, I suppose, questions that I tried to put this to Africa to the end of the interview, and that was around, what was the motivations, for investigating PAGAD, aside for methods, and you can come back to me on that, that question that I had around, the controversy around PAGAD's methods that, of course, it employed. But I want to deal with that, in tandem with this idea that, the state, of course, had seen a growing concern here about, in fact, as you say here, I'm going to read a bit of the book where he says, by 1999, PAGAD relinquished all efforts to portray itself as a community organization, and its rhetoric mirrored its operational initiatives targeting the state, its supposed Western allies, and Cape Town's Jewish community. The murder of the magistrate Peter Ron, the bombing of PAGAD's task team office in Bellville, and the attempts to kill myself and Dramat were only some manifestations of this decisive turn. At the political level, Qibla established a new front, Muslims Against Global Oppression, MAGO, to provide political cover and mobilize against the Western and Jewish targets. MAGO members all doubled as PAGAD members, and some had very intimate links with the members of the G-Force, especially the Qibla-linked bombing corps. And then goes to cite people like Mu'ain Ahmad and others, in that, and it goes on and on and on. But there seems to be, a pattern here of highlighting what is Africa's concern about, PAGAD, not just a community organization concerned about gangsterism and drugs, but that, it became a lot more than that. And that, of course, I want to tie in again with issues around methods that you said you were going to respond to, Cassiem.
Let me first say this. I need to say to you, I need to say to the listeners, and use this as the example, that with the global issue happening, with the assault and genocide that the genocidal state of Israel is visiting upon the Palestinians, and with their arrogance in attacking the Islamic Republic of Iran, against that background, there is a protest meeting, a protest that is being planned on Thursday, 12:30 to 1:30 in front of Parliament. PAGAD is supporting this. PAGAD is saying this is implementation of truth and forbidding what is wrong. Now, if the rest of the world wants to think that this has diverted PAGAD's program of fighting gangsterism and drugs, then they're living in another reality. We have the right to say just the fact that our stated objective and our real objective is to oppose drugs and gangsterism. But we will support an initiative that we believe is something that is worthy supporting. And nobody's going to stop us to do that. But it doesn't divert us from our program. And that is the same thing that when intelligence communities, then when they want to distort people's views and visions by saying that our support for a cause indicates our inclination and our diversion of our program, then it's not, we're not going to change the intelligence community's mind. But we need to tell the people who listen to these intelligence agents who are there to undermine community organizations that let's listen to them and let's say to them, don't talk nonsense.
Okay. Let's, talk about the infamous G-force. How much of that was in the control of the leadership of PAGAD? Because a lot of the book, which to be fair to you, of course, you say you haven't read the book, and I don't think very many people have the book. It's just been released very recently, and would be available. I'm not entirely sure where, but I have a copy of it, and I'm still busy reading it. It's one of those we have to keep on going back to try and make sense of what is being claimed in the book. But a big part of the book here deals with the role of the G-force. Now, that, of course, not to confuse what is the current understanding of a G-force that's also operating as a separate structure, different organization. I'm not certain. I know that is a bone of contention. I'm not going to make that the focus. Yeah, but the G-force, at least, in the iteration of the 90s that operated, with inside PAGAD. Can you confirm that there was this G-force? What was the purpose of the G-force, and what sort of control and understanding was there in what the G-force had done, and whether that was the expression of the PAGAD leadership?
Okay, so PAGAD is proud to say that there were people who were prepared to defend the defenseless. And these people formed part of PAGAD. Now, when you have an organization like PAGAD, and you think that you're going to be able to put fear into the hearts of the gangsters by just going to say nice things to them, then you are, and I'm going to use the word that Africa used, then you are naive. The gangsters will laugh at you. So we're under no illusion that we can go there with softly. Now, the issue is that when intelligence and state is worried that PAGAD was a threat to the state, was the same intelligence not concerned that gangsters and drug dealers were a threat to the state? And this is what we're saying, that if PAGAD went and tackled the drug dealers, then it should be seen as in defense of the state. What your question about the operation is, and I will quote something that we've consistently said. If the community was involved with drugs and gangsterism, we would go and the leadership would go and say, stop your nonsense, because we've listened to the community, and the community says that we need to tell you, if you don't stop your drugs, then we will take you head on. Now, that wasn't PAGAD leadership saying. PAGAD leadership was conveying the message of the neighbors of the drug dealers. And we are not prepared to say that anybody who took down a drug dealer or who took down a drug dealer's house was wrong, because we understand their pain. We didn't instruct them, but if people in the community decided enough is enough, we will applaud them. We didn't plan it. We didn't say to them to do it, but we're never going to condemn a fact. Not now, not yesterday, not today, not tomorrow. They can throw us in jail for saying drug dealers must die.
I'm not certain whether you are not comfortable talking about the G-force, but I'm gonna try and just try and understand exactly what the positioning of the G-force was at the time, Cassiem. This was
Okay.
what, around 1996 or so, 1997. When things came to quite the head. And look, this has been a center of controversy in understanding. Yes, you're highlighting what are the sort of broad objectives and the goals of PAGAD, and what had certainly been the foundation driving all of that. But am I supposed to read between the lines in you saying that yes, for some, these actions may have been seen as unsavory, but there was a noble effort behind it, and that was to save society. Is that essentially what you're saying, or were there
Well, let me say
scenarios
two
where
things.
where PAGAD itself had to distance itself from the actions of the G-force?
No, we're not saying that. First, I'm not saying that it was the G-force. The G-force was put in place in order to defend the people. So now let me say this. There were certain people who openly supported PAGAD in very drug-infested communities. And we've had situations where, and even when our support groups would go and have support in areas like Menenberg and so on, and they were threatened, then our G-force would go in and show their muscle and push the gangsters back and be that security that was needed in order to roll out the program. And that we are proud to say that the G-force was a beacon of hope for the community. Now, let me be clear about the specific actions that was taken against drug dealers and gangsters. That when Africa said, and I'm saying we have a reality that, I partially read the other book about PAGAD and people who, after having been imprisoned, said they can no longer spend time in prison, and therefore they negotiated with the same intelligence establishment and they sold their stories. But we're asking, how much truth is in all of this? But we do realize that, there's some horrendous crimes that is attributed to PAGAD. But the way intelligence communities work is when they infiltrate, and yes, PAGAD had been infiltrated, they get people to in terms of their act, to go and do horrendous things. So as things unfolded, when there were acts that was occurred, even if it was done, and they said in the name of PAGAD, which means that police attributed to PAGAD, we knew that when people were, and there were times when big drug dealers were taken out. We don't know who did it, but we never hesitated to applaud the fact that somebody had the courage to do it. But we also didn't hesitate to say, when we saw that there were things that were happening that the police were attributing to PAGAD, and we said we would never condone something like that. So I need to say we didn't put space between ourselves and actions just because we didn't want to be condoning physical action against drug dealers. But we definitely indicated to the community what we believed is the right thing and what is the wrong thing. But I need to indicate that there was never an instruction from PAGAD to say, go and do this and go and do that. But neither will we say we condemn an attack on a drug dealer or a gangster. But now let me say there's a big difference. When Africa, and indeed then, and I'm saying this, when PAGAD asked the question, not to the intelligence community, but to those community organizations that said, but why do you have to, what they call, take the law into your own hands? And we said, and we still say it today, do you think that PAGAD would want to take to the street if the police did their job? And they then said, but if you allow the police to do their work, then they can deal with it. Now we're asking the question, do you or anybody else think, and not to you, but to the people that are listening, do people think that after PAGAD had reduced its activity, that the police have actually done their job in order to deal with crime? Now, Africa says that it's not the right thing to do. If you understand gangsterism and drugs, that it's not the right thing to do to terminate the life of a big drug dealer. But so we're saying, did you not realize that it became very difficult for people to sell drugs at one stage when the community put pressure on the drug dealers? Now, if you have a different view, what is your option in order to stop gangsterism and drugs? And if you have an option, did you roll it out? Because I saw, the community saw, that there was fear from drug dealers at the time when PAGAD didn't get the state to defend it like USA is defending Israel. The state defended the drug dealers because they knew they were going to be demolished. Now, what is the state doing if they say that death to the drug dealers is not an answer?
We are talking to Cassiem Parker, a representative, part of the working committee for the People Against Gangsterism and Drugs. We are affording PAGAD a right of reply to the interview we had yesterday with David Africa, who is, of course, the author of the book Lives on the Line. David, of course, was an intelligence officer that is taking credit as part of a broader team for having, supposedly, destroyed PAGAD, or at least the G-Force, and having infiltrated PAGAD, Qibla, and the Islamic Unity Convention. Cassiem, I want to deal with the issue around infiltration and how this was understood. I'm certain there was heightened paranoia at some stage about who to trust when there were claims around false flag, events that were happening and so on. And I want to read a passage from the book and maybe to hear your response there too. David writes, Africa writes that one winter morning in early 1996, he met somebody that he refers to as Scholar. This was a young alim, an Islamic scholar that he met at the upmarket Vineyard Hotel in Newlands. And, he talks about how this particular scholar was very much liked by everyone and had the trust of everyone. And that Africa talks about having required people to brief the intelligence community on the developments within the province regarding PAGAD's evolving tactics and in turn the violence. Naturally, we were prepared to generously reward such persons as a measure of our gratitude. After lengthy discussions regarding working procedures, we signed a contract outlining the responsibilities of the researcher. As an afterthought, the researcher meaning the informant. As an afterthought, I mentioned that we prefer to keep these contracts and our relationship confidential. He goes on to write that we sent someone who was not a member to join the target structure and infiltrate the right places. Our new recruit was particularly resourceful and ingenious. Before long, he became a trusted member of PAGAD and was respected by members of the G-Force. Scholar was bedded in when the COVID unit initiated our campaign to penetrate the G-Force. He was well placed to identify potential recruits and to monitor the general mood within the G-Force circles. He goes on to highlight, and I'm just skipping a couple of paragraphs, but still sticking with the same passage of work. He goes on to say that Scholar was a likable and a caring young man who just crept into people's hearts. They entrusted their dearest secrets to him, and he in turn transmitted them to us. He worked with dedication at a pace that far exceeded the monetary gain he obtained from our collaboration. At some point, we were concerned for his mental well-being as the strain of the work, as usual, started to show, even though he refused to mention this to us. When we then got into the habit of setting aside a week or so every year and arranging a holiday for him and his wife, or one of the number of you talk about lovers he had on the side. Whatever made Scholar happy made us happy. And then it goes on and talking about the ways in which they infiltrated PAGAD. How much of that at the time was known to PAGAD? That there were individuals that, was deemed suspicious, though from what Africa is writing here was that PAGAD would never have known, given how close some of their informants had been to the top leadership.
Yeah, I think that, when you live a reality and you live at the pace that is needed, I think we need to reflect that PAGAD people didn't have PAGAD as their any source of income, because we have natural working lives, we carry on with our work, and then we do PAGAD. Now, we are also not and never were under the impression that there wouldn't be an attempt to infiltrate PAGAD in terms of intelligence and so on. But, when you're looking at suspicion with everybody, for everybody around every turn, then it's also negative. So we do what we do. When it becomes manifestly clear that somebody is busy with a devious program, then obviously our tentacles needs to be heightened. But we have to accept that the degree of infiltration in PAGAD, while the operation was on, was more severe than we had thought. The intelligence community must also accept that the process was people were imprisoned unjustly, and then because of their weakness while being imprisoned, then the intelligence community went and made deals with them. Some while the process was on, and then people were released and so on. And obviously, I think in terms of a lesson to us as we grow again, and to other emerging community organizations, because there are young people that will face these realities, is that it's very important that if you're doing it for the right reason, don't assume that people who are with you physically are actually with you by heart.
Okay, I suppose as we begin to wrap up, I want to maybe in a slightly different way put the same question to you that I put to Africa yesterday. And I questioned him on whether he believes that, going after PAGAD achieved their intended goals, whatever that may have been. That going after people whose stated goal had been in the majority to go after drugs and gangsterism. And of course, the fact that PAGAD had for the longest time, claimed that there were efforts to subvert and redirect and that sort of thing. Together with, I think the question that you raised from the get-go is, when you say crimes against the state, what crimes are being referred to, and who is the crime being committed against, when the focus was gangsters and drug dealers? I also put it to Africa that it is now a matter of fact, a matter of public record, that crime intelligence officers, particularly in the Western Cape, were seen to be working with underworld figures that were involved in the illicit economy, particularly drugs that were being smuggled into the Western Cape. And how, there's lots of evidence of that happening then and even now, with some very serious cases in the courts at the moment, in which we now know that there is somewhat of a synergy between crime intelligence and the underworld, what is these days referred to as the underworld. And I mean, back then we had the likes of Cyril Beaker and those sorts of names being used and named as individuals that formed part of these operations. With that being said, how do you then understand, what you think was the role of crime intelligence in targeting and trying to infiltrate PAGAD? Do you believe the goal was then to protect that illicit economy and by extension protect those organized criminals? I mean, yesterday a listener was making the point about, and I think this listener says he was a former member of PAGAD or was involved with PAGAD at the time, but he spoke about how particularly the state had ramped up its operations against PAGAD when the firm had been established. And the firm, for those that's not quite familiar with that, was really just an establishment, an organization of big high-flying gangsters that came together to try and offset the threat that they were facing from PAGAD. And so I suppose what I'm asking you in a very long-winded way, Cassiem, is whether you believe that there was a shaky relationship between organized crime and crime intelligence, and whether perhaps the targeting of PAGAD was in some way or the other. And I'm not trying to prompt you to give me that answer. I'm just trying to understand whether that is of your orientation, that there was this symbiotic relationship between intelligence and organized crime, and PAGAD was a threat to that.
Well, when Africa said this started as a hunch on their side, we also had a responsibility to have what I call a hypothesis and then go around and say, hang on, is there any sense in this? So anybody that's investigated and looked at liberation movement has seen and knows that in the unfortunate history of some of the liberation movement, they used drug running to fund their processes. And in terms of that, there's a payback that we believe was needed in terms of continuous funding of the organizations. So now when this happens, you can make sense that when they say PAGAD is a threat to the state, it actually could be, and by virtue of the fact that the associations of some of the leading police and statesmen with drug and gang bosses, you can see that the link is, if PAGAD takes down the organized crime infrastructure, then some of the funding that is going towards these parties is going to be targeted, and therefore it will be a problem for what they call the state. Now, we also need to be very clear that while PAGAD had criticism of the way the democratic process followed, there are many people that came from diverse backgrounds, that some were even supportive of the previous regime, but they've learned that, the way we need to go forward is to say, if these drug dealers are a problem for our children, they have no place in our society. So to answer your question, we are confident that the pushback by the state was because they had links and were being supported by the drug dealers, and therefore they needed to protect them and protect their turf by going after PAGAD.
Cassiem Parker, thank you very much, certainly, for your time. Cassiem, of course, is a part of the working group of the People Against Gangsterism and Drugs, responding there to David Africa's book, Lives on the Line.
This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.